The Atlantic triggered an online debate with an article titled, "Let's Declare a Pandemic Amnesty." It called for forgiveness rather than accountability for the public health and political establishment on the way they handled the COVID-19 policies. According to Dr. Aaron Cariardi, however, accountability is needed. Dr. Cariardi is the former director of the Medical Ethics Program at the University of California, Irvine, and author of the new book, The New Abnormal. We speak with him about where the medical establishment is heading with new powers created under COVID-19, historical examples of how the Nazis used similar policies under the Third Reich, and where the world is heading if nothing is done to stop the rise of a new medical tyranny. Hey, Dr. Aaron Cariardi, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Josh. Great to be with you again.
Yeah, it's been a while. I think last time we talked was when you were having this whole spat with the University of California, and it's been a long road for you, actually.
It's been an interesting year.
I want to talk to you. Yeah, for all of us, but I think for you especially. And you've been kind of the canary in the coal mine when it comes to what we risk with the whole COVID-19 pandemic. I know you did this new book about the biomedical security state. It's called The New Abnormal. And it seems that everything you warned about previously is, in fact, coming to pass. And I want to go into this with you. I mean, just kind of laying out the stage. We recently saw this Atlantic piece calling for amnesty over the pandemic. A lot of people came out and they were very unhappy about it. They said, no, we do not need amnesty. We need people held accountable lest this happens again. And it looked for a bit like the pandemic was done. It looked like everything was over. And then all of a sudden, they're coming out with all these new announcements suggesting that they are going to do it again. I want to ask you, I guess just from the top, what's going on right now?
Yeah, so this question of pandemic amnesty, which was a proposal published in the Atlantic Monthly, saying, look, we didn't know, especially early in the pandemic, what we were doing. And so it's time to forgive and forget and move on. And there's something very appealing about this proposal. Certainly, we're now living in a society where people are deeply divided. And many of those divisions have to do with families divided or friendships ended over disputes about COVID pandemic policies, essentially, whether someone was going to be invited to Thanksgiving dinner if they hadn't been vaccinated or refused to wear a mask, this sort of thing. So society is hurting in the wake of basically everything that we've been through in the last 3 years, from lockdowns to mask mandates, vaccine passports, and of course, the fear of the virus itself. And so it's a really important question. How do we heal and reunite the social divisions that have come about because of our response to COVID? So I'm in favor of reconciliation and I'm in favor of forgiveness, but it has to be done with integrity. It has to be done right. And so my worries about the proposal for amnesty as it's been articulated is a plea that, first of all, we didn't know what we were doing. But the fact was there were a lot of people that did very early on call into question many of these policies, from lockdowns to school closures. There were critics, but those critics were sidelined, were marginalized, were vilified. And, in some cases, many of those people actually lost their jobs, their livelihoods. So it wasn't just a matter of ignorance. It was a matter of a very deliberate effort to censor certain voices that were not going along with the mainstream public health narrative. Yeah. So people didn't have access to one side of the debate. We ended up with a false scientific consensus, or a false appearance of a consensus projected toward most members of the general public, unless they were digging deeper and reading the Epoch Times or watching your show or looking to various voices on Substack to get a different view of what was happening. So amnesty, no. Forgiveness and reconciliation, yes. But with forgiveness and reconciliation, I think we could take a cue from the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that society engaged in after South African apartheid, for example, or following the Rwandan genocide. Obviously, situations in which there were deep wounds, deep social divisions, very serious wrongs had been done, and people had genuinely suffered, massive injustices. But the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, to be done with integrity, had to begin with truth. There was no reconciliation without a public acknowledgement and a public owning of responsibility for the harms that were done. And that's what we didn't see in the Atlantic piece or similar commentaries. What we saw instead, I fear, was not a request for forgiveness following an apology for harms that were done, but we saw an attempt for many in our public health establishment to sort of forgive themselves and to sweep the harms under the carpet, yes. Right? So for authentic reconciliation, you have to begin with truth and acknowledgement that wrong was done. You also have to make efforts to rectify those harms. So some of the harms cannot be rectified. People who suffered massive vaccine injuries and were not allowed appropriate informed consent when they took those vaccines because they did so under duress. They may have permanent disabilities. Some people have died as a consequence of these vaccines. Many people have died or lost their jobs or lost their livelihoods as a consequence of lockdowns. Those harms can't fully be remedied or rectified, but to the extent that they can, there needs to be a good faith effort to do that. So people who lost their jobs under unjust vaccine mandates that didn't actually advance public health should be offered their jobs back with back pay. As we saw recently, the court required New York City to do that for city workers that had been unjustly terminated under the city's vaccine mandate. So I think we need more of that. That is what is going to facilitate healing and make possible reconciliation and social unity. If we just try to paper over the harms and wipe our hands clean of the harms that were done and say, hey, let's forgive and forget and everyone move on. That's not really authentic forgiveness and reconciliation. That's sort of excusing myself and sidestepping the responsibility that our leaders and our public health establishment needs to assume if we're going to move forward.
You raise some important points here because any kind of real reconciliation, as you noted, I think the part that maybe we can have is forgiving each other as individuals. Uncle
Yes.
Joe, who maybe demanded that you wear a mask at the dinner table. I might be unhappy about that, but, hey, forgive and forget. But what we
Absolutely.
really need to deal with, as you mentioned, is clarifying really the truth of the situation and getting the facts out right. And also to put an end through the facts, the biomedical security state. And, the concerning thing we have, as you mentioned, like apartheid and so on, the concerning thing we have is that typically the worst types of human rights abuses happen under the sanction of law. And when law allows, in other words, it's legal. It's legal in the state in which it is practiced. And
right.
Of course, all the different government officials who've enacted laws around this or, enacted really totalitarian laws like here in New York City, it was done legally, just like the guards and the concentration camp said, hey, they were just following orders. How do we approach that type of issue with this?
Yeah, that's an excellent question and a really good point. I think the first step is to gain a better historical awareness of the fact that simply because something is legal doesn't mean that it's just, doesn't mean that it's good, that in fact atrocities have been committed. And you mentioned Exhibit A, you alluded to in terms of the Third Reich. I begin the book, The New Abnormal, with the opening sentence says, this book is about our future, but I begin with a tale from the not so distant past. And that's in the prologue. The title of the prologue is Nuremberg 1947. And I look at the eugenics movement in the United States, Great Britain, which led to the eugenics movement in Nazi Germany, which led ultimately, taken to its logical conclusion, to the horrifying experiments that were done by Nazi physicians on death camp prisoners. And the Nuremberg trials, which convicted half a dozen of those physicians to death. Essentially, the death penalty was meted out. The Nuremberg trials had to rely upon this legal doctrine of crimes against humanity, a sort of natural law type argument that says there are some things that you can't not know, right? There are certain things that can never be done to another human being, even if the state happens to be permitting it at the moment in the regime that you're living under. Because uncomfortable as it might be, it's important to look at the defenses that those physicians mounted during the Nuremberg trials. And they had several arguments, but one of them is the one that you just mentioned, that everything they did was legal under German law, under the Nazi T4 euthanasia program and the other laws permitting these experiments. And so, I'm a German citizen, what law are you prosecuting me under if everything that I did was legal in the nation state in which I reside? And that's a very tough legal question to answer. The other thing that grew out of Nuremberg, which I mentioned in the prologue of the book, is of course the Nuremberg Code, which most people have heard of, but have not necessarily read. I encourage our viewers to go out and actually read the Nuremberg Code. You can find it online. It's very short. It's like 2 pages long. And the opening principle, the first principle articulated in the Nuremberg Code, is the medical ethics doctrine of informed consent, that you cannot do research on a person. And later that was applied also in the clinical context. You cannot give someone a medical intervention if they are a competent adult without their consent. And if they're a child who's not able to give consent, consent has to be obtained from their parent or guardian. This was precisely the very principle of bioethics that was discarded during the pandemic, especially with vaccine mandates. That was the reason I put my stake in the ground and challenged the University of California's vaccine mandate in federal court. This was the issue you and I talked about last time I was on the show. That case, by the way, is still in federal court, and it hasn't been settled yet at the appellate level. And fortunately, the CDC recently endorsed my central position in that case. They finally caught up to the science that I was trying to articulate about vaccines and about natural immunity. So it's precisely during wartime or pandemic or other crisis type situations that it's most important for us to adhere to our ethical and legal principles, because it's precisely in those times where there's a lot of fear, where there's a sense of impending doom or crisis, that we're most tempted to jettison or throw overboard those principles. But the only thing that can result from that is more harms and more injustices.
And, I think for some people, they'd say, well, can you really compare the two? I know you described to me in the last interview the way the Germans actually justified their genocides. The Nazis justified the genocides under this idea that there was an illness on the body politic.
That's
and
right.
They expanded that to be like, human illness, essentially, that, groups of people were impacting the health of the nation and they killed them. We
That's
see
exactly
similar
right.
narratives. Yeah, just real quick, we see similar narratives being used against the non-vaccinated. This idea of, you're killing grandma, where, volcanoes erupted on one island and they only let the vaccinated off the island. I mean, it's crazy. but getting into the Nuremberg Code, you mentioned something very important, which is you see the Nuremberg Code being violated. Do you think it's accurate to draw this type of comparison, though, between what the Nazis did and with what's happening right now, if they are in fact violating the Nuremberg Code?
I do think, as Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. So it is important to look for historical analogies that can shed light on our present moment. And of course, as your question sort of suggests, anytime you try to draw an analogy to the Third Reich, people quite sensibly, I think, react to that and say, whoa, that's, you're calling us Nazis. Not at all. Okay, so let me be clear. I'm comparing neither the current nor the previous administration to Hitler's regimes. I'm not comparing what happened to unvaccinated or any any other group of people over the last 3 years. I'm not comparing that to the horrors of the Nazi regime or the Holocaust. What I'm trying to do is draw people's attention to the ethical and legal principles that are underlying both of these historical moments. And the reason that is important is that we are permitted to choose our premises and our foundational principles and our philosophical assumptions, you could say. But eventually, through the course of history, those will be worked out to their logical conclusion, right? So the story I tell in the prologue doesn't start in Nazi Germany. It starts in the United States. When people hear the word eugenics, they don't typically think of the US and Great Britain, but the eugenics movement began in the Anglo-American countries and was only later exported to Germany. And so it's important for us to understand that story, because we didn't go as far as Germany. We had involuntary sterilization laws, and hundreds of thousands of people were involuntarily sterilized in 27 different states in the US. That continued for a couple of decades, actually, in some states, even after World War II and even after Nuremberg. But the Germans took that to its logical conclusion. And so what happened over the last 3 years is obviously not at the same degree of atrocity or human rights violations as what we saw in Germany in the 1930s and the 1940s. But if the premises are the same, then we are embarking upon a road that can take us to very dark places. The legal mechanism that permitted everything that happened during the pandemic was the declared state of emergency, both at the federal level and at the state level. So here in my home state of California, we're still operating under a state of emergency in which the governor accrues additional powers that he can delegate to unelected officials, public health bureaucrats. And at the federal level, we're still operating under a declared state of emergency for COVID. Even though President Biden, a month ago in 60 Minutes, said that the pandemic is over, which was true, it's been over for quite some time, but his advisors immediately panicked and said, no, you can't say that. The reason they panicked, even though that message would have been good for Joe Biden's party, it's like, we're through the worst of it, things are getting better. But his advisors panicked and said, you can't say that, because they knew, okay, if the pandemic is over, then the declared state of emergency has to be over. That's been renewed every 3 months to almost no media attention by HHS Secretary Javier Becerra with the endorsement of the president. The president gains 128 additional extra constitutional powers during a declared state of emergency that he wouldn't otherwise have. So if that emergency is sundowned, he'll have to relinquish those powers. And his delegates in the administration who are exercising emergency powers would also have to give up those powers. So again, to look back to a key historical analogy, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. It's instructive to note that the Germans governed, the Nazi Germans, the Nazi Party governed for virtually the entirety of its existence under Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution, which permitted, guess what, the suspension of German laws during a time of emergency. And that emergency, again, which was framed in public health and the health of the Volk, the body politic sort of language, that emergency lasted 12 years. So the Nazis never actually discarded or abrogated the Constitution of the Weimar Republic. They simply held it in abeyance. They suspended it through this legal mechanism of a declared state of emergency. So this is an issue that a lot of Americans are not paying attention to. We're focused on specific pandemic policies and were they good and were they bad and what were the benefits, what were the harms. That conversation is very important, but undergirding everything that happened during the last 3 years, all of the pandemic measures that were taken, especially the more authoritarian or invasive measures, was this declared state of emergency in which constitutional rights are temporarily suspended. And so it's important for us, I think, as a first step to recovering from everything that happened, to demand some judicial and legislative checks and balances on the executive's ability to unilaterally declare an emergency and unilaterally decide when that emergency is over. The threshold for what constitutes a federal emergency for a pandemic has never been defined in law. The legislature should define it in law. That would permit a judicial check on the system, right? Is if that criteria is no longer being met, citizens could file suit in federal court saying you've got to relinquish those emergency powers. We could put laws in place that would allow for legislative or judicial review on a periodic basis, right? Maybe the president can declare a state of emergency, lasting 3 weeks unilaterally. But then Congress has to convene, or the state legislature has to convene and decide whether to renew that emergency. And so every 90 days when it's renewed, it's done not by an unelected public health bureaucrat who's appointed by the very person who's gaining additional powers by that emergency, but reviewed by elected officials who can be, held to account and have to explain themselves if they're going to continue the emergency. So this is an issue that I talk about in the last chapter of the book that I think is an important policy reform that we should be paying attention to if we want to avoid the kind of response to a declared public health crisis that we had during COVID. If we want to avoid that for whatever the next declared public health crisis is going to be.